The concept of the master and slave morality is central to Nietzsche's 1887 book, The Genealogy of Morals. In this book, Nietzsche outlines two types of morality that have their origin in the ancient world. The first is master morality, in which an aristocratic class designates itself as good and then, as an afterthought, designates the outsiders to that aristocracy, the plebeians, the barbarians, the foreigners, as bad. This mode of moral valuation is therefore what Nietzsche calls self-legislating. The master morality's core concepts are good and bad, not good and evil. The master morality begins from the valuation, what I am is good, what is equal to me is good, and whatever is beneath me is not even worth consideration. Quite apart from our modern notion of evil, what the master morality calls bad is not to be fought or contested with. It is simply disregarded. Nietzsche's example of this mode of valuing is the pagan Greek, who celebrated physical beauty, worldly accomplishment, and wealth. For them, arrogance, ambition, and cunning were not vices, but virtues. The slave morality originates with the underclass. Their moral designations are, essentially, externally directed. The slave morality's core concepts are good and evil, or to speak more precisely, evil and then good. They begin with the designation evil, and apply this designation to all those they find to be harmful or terrifying. For the slave morality, good is the secondary consideration, the afterthought. The good man is the harmless man, the one you do not have to worry about. The primary feeling driving the slave morality is resentment. Resentment is the inner state of someone who is harmed, threatened, or coerced, but who cannot defend themselves or repay the harm done. In other words, a state of impotence. The definitive example of this mode of valuation is the Christian slave in ancient Rome. The Christian religion imagines a revenge against their worldly oppressors in hell or on Judgment Day. And this is precisely because the slaves could never accomplish such a revenge in the real world. To sum up, for Nietzsche, the strong will inevitably create one set of values out of their strength, and the weak will create an opposing set of values out of their weakness. It is often said that Western civilization originates out of the marriage of Athens and Jerusalem, and thus does Nietzsche argue that the modern Westerner thinks in terms of both types of morality, to varying degrees, even though these two modes of thought are mutually exclusive. Now, there is a lot more to this idea, and if you're looking for an in-depth examination of the master and slave morality, I did an extensive analysis of it in an early episode of the Nietzsche podcast. I'll include a link to that video in the description. What I want to talk about in this video is the confusion surrounding this idea. Even though it doesn't take long to lay out the basic premises of the master and slave morality, it may not be clear what one ought to take from this exactly. Is Nietzsche an advocate for the master morality, wishing for a return to that mode of valuing? Is Nietzsche a completely neutral party who merely intends to describe the psychological background of each form of morality without taking a side? And, setting aside Nietzsche's own aims, why wouldn't the average person who is not an aristocrat therefore take up for the slave morality, the morality of the underclass? Most such attempts at understanding the master-slave dichotomy fail in one way or another. First, let's consider the notion that the Nietzschean position is a simple return to the master morality of antiquity. This position would ignore that Nietzsche describes, quote, higher cultures as a mix of the master and slave morality. See Beyond Good and Evil, number 260. This would also ignore his assertion that the tension created by the interplay of master and slave morality is a productive one, quote, a magnificent tension of the soul, such as had not existed anywhere previously. With such tensely strained bow, one can now aim at the furthest goals, end quote. Nietzsche makes it clear that his point is not to, quote, unbend the bowstring. Furthermore, we would also have to ignore the many denunciations of romanticism in Nietzsche's work and the numerous descriptions of Nietzsche's philosophy as future-oriented. Beyond Good and Evil is called a prelude to the philosophy of the future, and in that book, the philosopher of the future is the anticipated figure. Nietzsche does not frame his goal as a return to the past, but on the other hand, we cannot conclude that Nietzsche is totally neutral in his evaluation of these two forms of morality. He described the central dichotomy throughout his work as Dionysus versus the crucified, in other words, the Greek morality versus the Christian morality. It is very clear from the total body of Nietzsche's work that he sides with the Greek morality, and that he sees the Christian morality as harmful to life. In the concluding section of the Genealogy's first essay, Nietzsche makes it clear, quote, what I mean by that dangerous motto which is inscribed on the body of my last book, Beyond Good and Evil. At any rate, that is not the same as beyond good and bad. End quote. Remember when we said that good and evil are the core moral designations of the slave morality, and good and bad are the core designations of the master morality? Beyond good and evil can therefore be translated as beyond the slave morality, and not, at least not necessarily, beyond the master morality. But then, supposing that Nietzsche prefers the master morality, why should we? It is not uncommon to encounter this layman's criticism of Nietzsche. If Nietzsche is arguing for a return to a morality that results in selfishness, ambition, and cruelty, doesn't it advantage the average person to oppose Nietzsche and advocate for the morality of charity, humility, and compassion? Why wouldn't we choose slave morality if it advantages us to do so? Why wouldn't we advocate for resentment, supposing that the resentment of the weak could be a check against the power of the strong? Dealing with this objection is a bit more complicated, but in understanding how this criticism of Nietzsche goes astray, we'll be better positioned to understand the actual implications of the master and slave morality. What this criticism misunderstands is that slave morality is not a repudiation of cruelty. In fact, the masterstroke of Nietzsche's entire argument is his observation that slave morality is in fact rooted in cruelty. Nietzsche doesn't believe that we have a simple choice between cruelty and compassion, or between selfishness and selflessness. From Nietzsche's point of view, true selflessness does not exist. It is simply a refined, subtle version of selfishness. Quote, "The girl in love wishes that she might prove the devoted faithfulness of her love through her lover's faithlessness. The soldier wishes that he might fall on the battlefield for his victorious fatherland, for in the victory of his fatherland, his greatest desire is also victorious. The mother gives the child what she takes from herself: sleep, the best food, in some instances even her health, her wealth. Are all these really selfless states? Isn't it clear that, in all these cases, man is loving something of himself, a thought, a longing, an offspring, more than something else of himself? That he is thus dividing up his being and sacrificing one part for the other." End quote. So, the problem with slave morality is not that it is actually selfless. Nietzsche calls into question whether selflessness even exists. The same is true when it comes to the apparent harmlessness of slave morality. Remember that the fuel of slave morality is resentment, the frustrated feeling of being unable to stop those who do you harm, unable to avenge the wrongdoing. Quote, "The revolt of the slaves and morals begins in the very principle of resentment becoming creative and giving birth to values. A resentment experienced by creatures who, deprived as they are of the proper outlet of action, are forced to find their compensation in an imaginary revenge." End quote. In practical terms, slave morality results in the creation of the doctrines of sin, of hell, of the last judgment. Christianity does not excise cruelty, but exalts it. Nietzsche cites the early Christian writer Tertullian, who writes that he will laugh and rejoice in seeing kings, philosophers, actors, poets, and all the non-Christians whom he hated burning in hell. In fact, he writes, this will be one of the main pleasures of heaven. But the slave's revolt in morality does not stop here. It is one thing for the downtrodden to imagine revenge against their oppressors, but Christianity does not merely take hold in the minds of the downtrodden. What happens when the prosperous or powerful person onboards the moral premises of slave morality? The main element of Christianity that comes to define European civilization for 2,000 years is guilt, also known as the bad conscience. Christianity deals with all of those impulses called evil by the impotent or harmless man by redirecting one's natural cruelty back towards one's self. Guilt is cruelty directed inward. Quote, "Enmity, cruelty, the delight in persecution, in surprises, change, destruction, the turning of all these instincts against their own possessors. This is the origin of the bad conscience." End quote. Therefore, if we take the term slave morality as Nietzsche meant it, as the overthrow of pagan values and the ascendance of Christian values, then we should ask ourselves a serious question. Did the ascendance of Christianity tangibly reduce the amount of cruelty and suffering in the world? Did Christian empires refrain from establishing worldly hierarchies, sacking cities, taking slaves, committing genocides? As a matter of historical fact, these acts of cruelty continued, and sometimes they were even carried out with a good conscience because now the people committing them believed it was done in the name of God. Upon a little sober reflection, we should not be surprised by this outcome. Slave morality operates in the world of idealism and imagination. Christianity in all content was a psychological revenge against the strong. But in the physical world, it commands its followers to obey the law of the land. The Christian is called to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Man continues to behave mostly as he already has. What slave morality actually accomplishes, therefore, is to layer psychological torment on top of the many physical torments that already exist as facts of life. Slave morality is not the path for achieving emancipation from anything. It changes nothing about the nature of life. It simply calls life itself evil and demands that we feel guilty for prospering within it. Under the regime of slave morality, all those who succeed or flourish are condemned. Meanwhile, the old cruelties of slavery and genocide continue, but now we have the new cruelties of guilt and fear for one's immortal soul. Quote, Christianity has made use of torments of the soul on an unheard-of scale and continues to preach this species of torture. Hell has, in truth, been more than merely a word, and the newly created and genuine fear of hell has been attended by a new species of pity corresponding to it, a horrible, ponderously heavy feeling of pity, unknown to former ages, for those irrevocably damned to hell. Plutarch gives a gloomy picture of the state of a superstitious man in the pagan world. This picture pales when contrasted with the Christian of the Middle Ages, who supposes he is no longer going to escape eternal torment. Dreadful portents appear to him. He is approached by the figures of dead relatives, their faces bearing the traces of fearful sufferings. Or, when he is asleep, the dark walls of his room grow bright, and there appear on them in a yellow exhalation the images of torture instruments, and a confusion of snakes and devils. Indeed, what a dreadful place Christianity had already made of the earth, when it everywhere erected the crucifix and thereby designated the earth as the place where the just man is tortured to death. End quote. So, in light of this, how are we to understand the master and slave morality, and the role this idea plays in Nietzsche's thought? First, we should take note of when and where this idea appears in his work. While there is a preliminary sketch of the idea, all the way back in Human All Too Human, the term master and slave morality takes its mature form in Beyond Good and Evil. Immediately after this, the work that treats the idea with the greatest rigor is Genealogy of Morality, which Nietzsche regarded as a kind of addendum to Beyond Good and Evil, since its task is to expand on the ideas of the book's final chapter. With this in mind, we should look to Ecce Homo, where Nietzsche explains the background of each of his books. His comments on Thus Spoke Zarathustra are the most extensive. He describes Thus Spoke Zarathustra as the book where he elucidates his affirmative philosophy. It is in Zarathustra that we get the grand ideas of the eternal return of the same, the overman, amor fati. The book immediately after Thus Spoke Zarathustra was Beyond Good and Evil, and Nietzsche makes it clear in Ecce Homo what it was he intended to do with this work. Quote, Now that the yes-saying part of my life task was accomplished, there came the turn of the negative portion, both in word and deed. End quote. He describes his call for other free spirits as a search for other souls to join in on his, quote, work of destruction, end quote. Nietzsche elaborates in the next section. Quote, In all its essential points, this book is a criticism of modernity, embracing the modern sciences, arts, even politics, together with certain indications as to a type which would be the reverse of modern man, or as little like him as possible, a noble and yes-saying type, end quote. Further in the section he continues, quote, The eye which, owing to tremendous constraint, has been accustomed to see at a great distance, is here forced to focus sharply on that which is close at hand, the present time, the things that lie about him, end quote. Further, we should also call to mind the subtitle of the Genealogy of Morals, a polemic. Polemic is a literary style defined as a strongly critical attack on or controversial opinion about someone or something. The target of Nietzsche's critique in the Genealogy is stated outright. Nietzsche attacks Paul Ray's On the Origin of Moral Sensations, a book that attempted to provide a naturalistic account of moral feelings. He also attacks the utilitarian understanding of morality promoted by English psychologists. The commonality is that both of these approaches to the psychology of morality reason backwards from the morality that we hold in modernity, effectively beginning with the modern morality as a conclusion and reasoning backward to what the psychological meaning must be. If we consider these facts, that this idea reaches its mature form during Nietzsche's so-called no-saying period, and that this idea attains a place of centrality in the Genealogy of Morals, a work Nietzsche describes as a critical attack, what must we conclude? Nietzsche's master and slave morality is a critique. Failing to see this is the great mistake that most make when approaching the master and slave morality. It is almost always considered as though it were intended as one of Nietzsche's affirmative ideas. But as Nietzsche tells us, this is a negative idea. He creates it as a means of attacking and destroying. Nietzsche's affirmative philosophy is not to be found in the master morality. The affirmative content of Nietzsche's philosophy had already been established in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The entire dichotomy of the master and slave morality is an afterthought, just as within the master morality itself, all that is called bad is an afterthought. To even have to undertake such a comparative study of moralities is only necessary because the modern morality is so unhealthy. The master morality serves, therefore, a very important function in Nietzsche's philosophy, but it is not to give us a blueprint of how society ought to run or how we ought to establish our own moral thought. Its function is to negate. And what is it intended to negate? Modernity, by exposing the slave morality. The apparent harmlessness and compassion of the slave morality is the mask for a cult of revenge. This is a serious psychological problem that has tainted everything in the modern world. Quote, "It is a painful and tragic spectacle that rises before me. I have drawn back the curtain from the rottenness of man. This word, in my mouth, is at least free from one suspicion, that it involves a moral accusation against humanity. It is used, and I wish to emphasize the fact again, without any moral significance. And this is so far true that the rottenness I speak of is most apparent to me precisely in those quarters where there has been the most aspiration hitherto toward virtue and godliness. As you probably surmise, I understand rottenness in the sense of decadence. My argument is that all the values on which mankind now fixes its highest aspirations are decadence values. I call an animal, a species, an individual corrupt, when it loses its instincts, when it chooses, when it prefers what is injurious to it. A history of the higher feelings, the ideals of humanity, and it is possible that I'll have to write it, would almost explain why man is so degenerate. Life itself appears to me as an instinct for growth, for survival, for the accumulation of forces, for power. Whenever the will to power fails, there is disaster. My contention is that all the highest values of humanity have been emptied of this will, that the values of decadence, of nihilism, now prevail under the holiest names." End quote. Nietzsche's philosophy often operates this way. Without some point of comparison, the underlying psychological reality of slave morality will remain unconscious. By giving us a contrast, by showing us the difference between these two modes of valuing, the sickness of the slave morality is dragged into the sunlight. And as we all know, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The point is not to lament that mankind no longer celebrates cruelty. The point is to show us that we never stopped celebrating cruelty. The ideologies which purport to abhor cruelty are in fact the worst offenders. The value of Nietzsche's negative philosophy is that it helps us better understand his affirmative philosophy by means of this contrast. The overman, the new goal for mankind, would be a figure who is completely free from resentment and the bad conscience. The affirmative vision of the overman is the image of health, power, and beauty. In other words, the flourishing of life. But, following from Nietzsche's negative philosophy, we must understand the overman as freedom from the slave morality that condemns all the aspects of flourishing life. The master morality is part and parcel with what Nietzsche called, in another passage in Beyond Good and Evil, the pre-moral era of mankind. In the pre-moral era, actions were understood as good or bad according to their consequences, but one did not reason from this that these actions sprung out of an intention. Nietzsche brings up the example of cultures such as ancient China, in which the shameful act of a son was also to the shame of his parents. No one would reason from the son's shameful act that the parents' intentions caused him to behave this way, however. Intention simply does not figure into the equation. It's purely consequentialist. The moral era of mankind, however, arises with the notion that people have a choice, an arbitrarily governing free will, that one can choose to act morally or immorally. In the Genealogy, Nietzsche explicitly ties this idea to the slave morality. Quote, "Just as the people separate the lightning from its flash and interpret the latter as a thing done, as the working of a subject which is called lightning, so also does the popular morality separate strength from the expression of strength. As though behind the strong man there existed some indifferent neutral substratum which enjoyed an option as to whether or not it should express strength. But there is no such substratum. There is no being behind doing, working, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction of the deed is everything." End quote. The moral subject, the neutral substratum, called the soul or the ego, is the metaphysical invention of the slave morality. The practical effect of this doctrine is to make the lion responsible for being a lion. It suggests that the predator has a choice. It could choose not to be a predator. From Nietzsche's perspective, however, this is a paralogism, a false syllogism. The will is not free, and the predator will continue to be a predator. This is why the slave morality accomplishes nothing in the physical world, and why its only effect in operation is to make the world guilty. But does Nietzsche argue for a return to the pre-moral age of mankind? No. In fact, he argues, quote, Is it not possible that we are standing at the threshold of a period which would be distinguished negatively as extra-moral, nowadays when, at least among us immoralists, the suspicion arises that the decisive value of an action lies precisely in that which is unintentional in it, and that all its intentionalities belong to its surface or skin? End quote. This is the meaning that we can now grasp with the aid of Nietzsche's affirmative philosophy. The value of master morality was that it saw life as innocent. It saw the world as innocent. But cruelty is also a part of life. Therefore, this cruelty was also innocent. This way of thinking is inevitably naive. It comes into being out of instincts. It is maintained by tradition and religion before mankind developed any conscious articulated theories of moral behavior. We could define the pre-moral age by the term unconscious innocence. The slave morality is a reaction to this. It makes cruelty evil, and thus it makes the powerful man who has a capacity to be cruel guilty. But the great secret is that slave morality itself is a form of cruelty, since all of us have cruel impulses to whatever degree. It takes revenge against life itself and implements its own cruel psychological torment in the form of bad conscience, fear of hell, and so on. We could therefore define the moral age by the term conscious guilt. But what of the extra-moral age? By making conscious the fictitious metaphysical premises of the slave morality, that is, the division between the doer and the deed, the extra-moral age would, by that same token, deliver us from guilt. Thus, we could define the extra-moral age with the term conscious innocence. If you want to understand Nietzsche's hopes for the moral future of mankind, a far more helpful passage than almost anything in the negative period is found in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Quote, "For man to be redeemed from revenge, that is for me the bridge to the highest hope and a rainbow after long storms." End quote. We can therefore understand Nietzsche's true hope, expressed by Zarathustra, as the conscious embrace of the world, the conscious return to innocence, now in full understanding of what that entails. While we could easily imagine an unthinking animal as innocent, in the sense that a lion has no sense of morality, could such a thing be possible for mankind, the rational animal, such a thing as innocence? This is the far-off goal that the great tension of the spirit has made possible for us to shoot for, because the slave morality made us conscious of ourselves in a profound way. Thus, perhaps paradoxically, we should be grateful to the slave morality for this error, which produced this tension of the soul. As Voltaire once remarked, "Believe me, friend, error too has its merits." If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.